We are discussing mechanisms of steroid hormone detoxification. We're going to take a start to finish look at that, and we're going to use some testing to do it. Here's what we have in store for today: a brief review of the 3 phases involved with steroid hormone detoxification. We'll take a look at some testing that helps us to track steps in each part, and we will work through a case. We'll use some test results to help build a personalized treatment plan, and I'm really excited about that today. Whenever assessing hormone levels, I always, of course, think about patient symptoms, but I also find it a lot easier to think about this acronym, the PTSD acronym. And if you've done some functional medicine trainings, you might have seen this before, but I wanted to mention this because it provides some orientation here. We are focusing on the detoxification, metabolism, and excretion part of this, not ignoring the other parts, of course. When in the clinical setting, we take into account all of that. But here today, for this presentation, we're focused on that detoxification aspect. So liver detoxification, we'll just run through the phases here. The first 2 phases are happening in the liver. The third phase is technically outside of the liver, but they're all connected. So it plays a crucial role in steroid hormone detoxification and utilizes really the P450 enzymes. The cytochrome P450 enzymes help to initiate the breakdown of a steroid hormone, a toxin, or a medication. Those enzymes help to modify the chemical structure of that substrate, and that's done with oxidation, reduction, hydroxylation. And what's important to know there is that after phase 1, some intermediates actually become more toxic. So then it becomes essential to make sure that phase 2 can keep up with phase 1. When I was learning this earlier on, I thought about this in terms of if we take the garbage out to the curb quicker than the garbage truck can come to pick it up, that can create a problem. We'll have a pile up at the curb. So I think I mention that just to say that it's important that these steps are sequential and balanced and functioning well all throughout. If that does not happen very well and we have this buildup of toxic intermediates after phase 1, then that's when we can start to see some oxidative damage or DNA damage, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we go through the presentation here. For phase 2, well, before we get into that, let me show you these phase 1 enzymes actually. The cytochrome P450 1A1, 3A4, and 1B1 play a big role in estrogen metabolism, and you can see those circled here in purple. Their metabolites do have nicknames. The 1A1, the 3A4, and the 1B1 are often called the good, the bad, and the ugly. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this diagram does show that estrogen, E1 and E2, so estrone and estradiol, are metabolized with those cytochrome enzymes here. All right, now phase 2. A key aspect of phase 2 is really making things more water soluble so we can excrete them. And after phase 1, we need to take it into phase 2. There, the reactions are glucuronidation, sulfation, and acetylation, even glutathione conjugation are important there. So these, at the end of that process, then they become water soluble, and then that would bring us into phase 3. Of note, in phase 2, the COMT enzymes do play a big role there. So I've circled these in purple as well. So before we get into phase 3, the COMT enzymes are playing a big role there. They are methylators. So we're taking those metabolites and adding a methyl group onto them to help that aspect of detoxification. So B vitamins are really important there. And we'll touch on that a little bit later as well. Okay, finally, phase 3, technically happening outside of the liver, should be a pretty simple process, right? We are excreting things through the kidneys or through the intestines, but it's heavily dependent upon gut and kidney function. And with 2/3 of people here in the US having some degree of digestive problems, we often have to do some work on the gut in order to facilitate that process. So thankfully, you have some great laboratory tools to help assess these areas in your patients. So the Endo Plus, the NutrEval, and the GIFX from Genova feature collections of innovative yet validated biomarkers. And the data within each test profile will help to answer some questions about what's going on in phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3. The Endo Plus is a modular test So it allows you to test blood, urine, and or saliva, and even a few genetic SNPs through a buccal swab. So you have the option to pick and choose what you want. If you want to check the estrogen metabolites, a first morning void urine will be required. That will include estrone, estradiol, and estriol, as well as their metabolites. So that's available in the Endo Plus. However, for a lot of patients, and I would say a lot of clinicians as well, if they want to see the sex hormones, then the salivary option is pretty attractive for that. That's also something you can order in the Endo Plus. So seeing the E1, E2, and E3 in the saliva can be really helpful there. So regarding detoxification, you can really get a lot of valuable insight when looking at, of course, the metabolites, but also the parent hormones as well, the E1, E2, and E3. I want to show you what those biomarkers would look like in the Endo Plus report. In my opinion, I think this would be an example of good results here, especially regarding the estrogen metabolites, which are shown in the upper right. We can see the 2-hydroxy, 16-alpha, and 4-hydroxy looking pretty good there. We also, it's useful to see that the upstream precursors are there as well. So the estrone, estradiol, and estriol in the upper left of the screenshot here tell us that there is enough precursor, and therefore, when you look at the downstream metabolites, you have a little more confidence in them with enough adequate precursors in place. So pretty good distribution of the phase 1 metabolites, even pretty good methylation activity here at the bottom left. You can see that methylation activity. That's comparing how much 2-hydroxy converts into 2-methoxy, which is a good place to visualize how well those methyl groups are being added on to estrogens. Here's an example of some not so good results. What we're looking at here is 4-hydroxy that's higher than the 2-hydroxy in terms of its position on the range. So that does look like a problem in terms of what's going on at the end of phase 1. We're making a lot of 4-hydroxy in this case. The 4-hydroxy does have some associations with breast cancer in women and prostate cancer in men. So it is, and that's because it can form quinones that can damage DNA. Not too bad in phase 2 in this case. The methylation activity was pretty good there. It would be a high methylation activity ratio that would be a problem. So in this particular example here, things were looking okay in terms of methylation, but the first phase seemed to be the bigger problem. In the Endo Plus, of course, you have the option to add on a few genomics. The one that's probably most relevant for our discussion today is the cytochrome P450-1B1. This is, of course, the enzyme that is upregulated when it's SNPed. So it runs a little faster when it's SNPed, and that means there's potential to make more 4-hydroxy estrogens from that. If we're making more 4-hydroxy estrogens, those can go on to form quinones, cause some DNA damage, and even have been associated with some neoplastic changes in cells. So you can see we look at a couple different locations on the 1B1 enzyme, but if you're seeing a SNP there, a red plus sign, that's telling you there's a SNP there, and the arrow next to it pointing upwards tells us that that enzyme is upregulated with a SNP. Okay, switching away from the Endo Plus for a moment, going into the NutrEval. It's a different test profile. Genova's NutrEval looks at organic acids, amino acids, fatty acids, oxidative stress markers, and some nutrient toxic elements. And that really helps to provide kind of a panoramic view of the metabolome. It helps to identify some nutrient needs, and really, really valuable test. Measures over 120 biomarkers in this one. So the table here summarizes part of the profile that's probably most pertinent to detoxification pathways. The B vitamin needs, which will be indicated on the second page of the test, those are important in both phase 1 and phase 2. Antioxidant needs are also assessed. Glutathione is measured, so that's important for mitigating any oxidative damage from the 4-hydroxy estrogens potentially. 8-OHDG is a measure of oxidative damage to DNA. That's measured in the NutrEval as well. Amino acids, these are important in that conjugation step in the second phase of liver detoxification. So conjugation and methylation will depend on having enough amino acids around to do that. And then, of course, you could add on a genomic. There's a genomic add-on available here as well. The one that's probably most relevant is the COMT genetic SNP. And we took a brief look at that earlier, but that's the one that's adding that methyl group onto an estrogen or catecholamine or an environmental toxin in phase 2. Couple screenshots from the NutrEval here. Most reports will be between 13 to 16 pages, and the first 6 pages is an algorithm-derived summary. So it looks at all of the biomarkers in the test, and those first 6 pages are able to account for what pathway is involved, what nutrient cofactor is required, and then we sort of bring all that information together, and we come up with this summary information and some functional imbalance scores, as well as some nutrient recommendations. So I find these functional imbalance scores really helpful for writing the functional assessment for my patients. If we're working on oxidative stress or mitochondrial dysfunction or methylation imbalance, really helpful to in a very short summary be able to write some kind of synthesis based on the test result there, just using the functional imbalance scores. All right, so the amino acids. There are several that I think are worth paying attention to in the NutrEval in the context of detoxification. And in this particular example, we're seeing several of these borderline low. So arginine, methionine, taurine, essential amino acids, and I think the overall trend is probably the most important in this particular screenshot, but we are seeing some that play a big role in detoxification that are a little bit on the low end. Cysteine and cysteine. Cysteine is the reduced form. Cysteine is the oxidized form. They can convert back and forth, and they are technically a precursor to building the glutathione molecule. Glutamine and glutamic acid, similar scenario there. Technically, glutamic acid is the precursor for glutathione, for making the glutathione molecule, but glutamine can be converted into glutamic acid. So it's helpful to look at both, and if you're seeing both of them elevated, that probably builds a stronger case for some supplementation potentially. All right, closer look at the COMT enzyme here. There's a summary here on the slide on the left, and there's some detailed commentary. It's smart commentary, so it will change depending on the test result, but that's true for our genomic results. They will give you some information about health implications as well as some clinical management considerations. So in this particular example, we see 2 SNPs. So one copy comes from mother, one copy comes from father. We don't know which was which, but 2 SNPs here, and the arrow pointing downward indicating reduced enzyme activity when it's SNPed. And in fact, when people have SNPs on both copy of the gene, there's about a 3 to 4 times reduction in that enzyme's ability to add that methyl group, and would be reasonable to think about some support with the B vitamins, and even things like magnesium are I think worth considering here in a case like this. All right, this slide kind of ties it together. Credit to the Metagenics Institute and Dr. Blake, I believe, for this nice graphic here. I like it because it summarizes a lot of the nutrients that help with phase 1, that help with phase 2, and even acknowledges the importance of phase 3. So a good reminder of the wide variety of nutrients that are required by the liver in order for this to work properly. Okay, last test profile we need to chat about today is the GI effects, our stool profile. It provides some really important information about digestion, absorption, inflammation, immune responses, and even the gut microbiome, and casts a pretty wide net around gut function. So the markers that are going to be most pertinent from the GI effects for our discussion this afternoon here are summarized in the table. We're thinking about beta-glucuronidase. High levels can lead to excessive recirculation of steroid hormones. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Commensal bacteria plays a big role in determining how much beta-glucuronidase we produce. And then, of course, you can also see stool consistency. So if a patient is constipated, reports hard or constipated for the stool consistency, then that might also be prompt to remind us about work needed on phase 3. You could probably make an argument to include protein and fat maldigestion. There are markers like protein products and fecal fats. I debated whether or not to put that in the table here. I think you could argue that we need amino acids, so protein maldigestion could be significant, and we need fat-soluble antioxidants, so fat maldigestion could be significant as well, could be important to take into account. But for the sake of simplicity, I've left those out here, but I did think about that a little bit afterwards, and I think protein products and fecal fats could also be indirectly related to what we're talking about here. Beta-glucuronidase, here's a closer look. It's a metabolite of the gut microbiome. Technically, it is an enzyme. There are several bacterial strains that are capable of making beta-glucuronidase. Staph, some species of Clostridium can do it, E. coli. Even though it's an enzyme, it does not participate in digesting food. I think that's an important distinction. It's a different kind of enzyme, and it plays a role in recirculating toxins rather than excreting them. So a little more detail on it is that it reverses that conjugation step in phase 2 of liver detoxification, and that allows a substance to be recirculated rather than excreted. And we're going to take a closer look at this in the next few slides. I think it's important to say that a moderate amount of beta-glucuronidase activity is probably preferred because it does play a role in recirculating some endogenous compounds, maybe phytonutrients, possibly even some vitamins. So it's not something that we completely want to shut down and suppress, but because it does recirculate some beneficial things. So a moderate amount is really what we like to see. But there's far more literature talking about high levels being a problem because that has associations with some colon cancers and hormone-related cancers. This is a nice graphic from a recently published study. Beta-glucuronidase is represented here in those light blue pentagons that are overlaid on the GI tract there. In the upper left, you can see estrogen passing through phase 1 and phase 2. It comes out in its conjugated form, so it's attached to a glucuronide molecule. At that point, it's set to be excreted through stool or urine. However, beta-glucuronidase in the GI tract in high amounts is deconjugating a lot of that, and that's resulting in more estrogen absorption rather than excretion. So with high beta-glucuronidase, we often talk about estrogen dominance. So in estrogen dominant patients, this can be a reason. It's not the only reason for estrogen dominance, but it can be a reason for estrogen dominance. Occasionally, we find low levels of beta-glucuronidase, usually after a patient takes an antibiotic. That seems to be the most common reason for that. And while we still regard that as a sign of dysbiosis, it's not really thought to be as concerning as high levels. So the graphic on the right here shows toxins and steroid hormones that are bound to glucuronide, and then the ones that are interfacing with beta-glucuronidase are the ones that are going to get recirculated. So watch that graphic as we take a look at high levels next. Here you can see a lot more beta-glucuronidase in the graphic there, a lot more being recirculated back to the liver. So more enterohepatic recirculation. That'll mean they have to go through phase 1 and phase 2 again. So that creates more of a burden on the liver. And that is something that might prompt you to think about liver support, milk thistle, other nutrients that support liver function. Calcium D-glucarate is the thing that probably gets mentioned the most in the context of high beta-glucuronidase levels. That is worthy of consideration because calcium D-glucarate will bind to beta-glucuronidase, making it less active. As far as the GI effects goes, here are a couple of screenshots. Functional imbalance course here on the first page. There is a summary of the commensal bacteria shown down there at the lower left. It's kind of a global assessment of the commensal bacteria, just telling us whether there was a balanced or an imbalanced pattern. And then you see the 24 commensal bacteria there listed on the right. For phase 3, there's a couple of different ways you could assess phase 3. One is by looking at the stool consistency, which is patient reported. So that'll be reported in the GI effects as long as the patient remembers to mark that on the vials or the requisition. But you could also consider asking more questions about bowel habits, maybe using the Bristol stool form scale. Those are some other options for thinking about, is this patient constipated and do we need to address that? That brings us to the case. And we have a 44-year-old female here today. Chief concerns are long-standing fatigue and anxiety. She works a stressful job. She eats a low-carb diet, takes a multivitamin that she found through social media. She is menopausal for 3 years, so she had menopause pretty early and was currently on bioidentical hormone replacement. Exercise was pretty good 3 times a week for anywhere from 30 to 50 minutes. She was a former athlete, cyclist, and so she does know that being active is important. She sleeps only about 6 to 7 hours per night and wakes up feeling tired. And for bowel movements, she tended towards constipation and some occasional bloating. Looking at her Endo Plus result, we see 2 functional imbalances here mentioned on the first page. One is for some sex hormone imbalance, and the other is for estrogen metabolism imbalance. So we're looking at some pretty robust estrogens and progesterone from the salivary specimen in this example, and some imbalanced estrogen metabolism as well. So we'll take a closer look at that. These are the salivary sex hormones in the Endo Plus. You can see progesterone and E2 levels seem pretty robust here, but reasonable given the bioidentical hormone replacement. So the x-axis on those graphs is corresponding to the patient's age, and the y-axis just shows you the different ranges you can compare them to. What's more notable here, though, I think, is the DHEA and testosterone. They are low, and androgens like DHEA and testosterone do play somewhat of a role in energy production. So that was one of her main concerns, so that did look important. Okay, we see the urine E1, E2 here. They are normal while the E3 is high. So estrone, estradiol looking normal in this case, a little bit different than what we saw for the salivary results. As a side note, there could be a variety of different reasons why we see differences between the specimen types when looking at hormones. And Genova is doing some statistical analysis on that, hoping to really advance our understanding of why that happens. But it's not unusual to see this type of phenomenon here. But back to the case, we're looking at estrogen metabolism. We see a problem in the distribution of the estrogen metabolites. So this looked significant here. She's making a lot more 4-hydroxyestrogen than she is 2-hydroxyestrogen. So the 4-hydroxy, those are the risky ones. The 2-hydroxy are generally thought to be more protective. She also carries the 1B1 SNP. So she had a SNP on both copies at the L432 location on the 1B1 enzyme. And I think a really good example here of how genotype can influence phenotype. We're seeing the genomics suggesting that pathway is upregulated or that enzyme is upregulated. And then, of course, we see the downstream effect with the 4-hydroxyestrogens. Would a dose adjustment for her make sense? Maybe. I think generally dose adjustments are probably best made by looking at multiple factors, not just one marker, but looking at the full clinical picture as well as other biomarkers to make those decisions. Okay, let's take a look at her NutrEval. This is the first page. We're seeing some moderate significance for oxidative stress and methylation imbalance based on the scores here. I think it's worth mentioning we're not measuring estrogen metabolites in the NutrEval. We are looking at pathways and processes that are directly or indirectly related to it, though. So methylation and oxidative damage, for instance. So even though 2-hydroxy and 2-methoxy conversion looked okay in the Endo Plus, this does look at multiple other pathways that are related to methylation, multiple other biomarkers, and I still think we could probably make a case for some conservative methylation support here. All right, the second page of the NutrEval looked like this for this patient. So we're seeing antioxidant needs that are moderate to high for most of them, aside from CoQ10. We're seeing some increased needs for a few of the B vitamins and moderately increased needs for things like magnesium and manganese, omega-3s, even some digestive enzymes and microbiome support. But one thing that really kind of sticks out here to me is down there at the bottom, the glycine recommendation. That was kind of a standout. The recommendation there was almost 3,000 milligrams of glycine, really important in the second phase of liver detoxification, that conjugation step. Glycine is also an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So people who are stressed, glycine may make a little more sense because of its inhibitory neurotransmitter properties as well. So kind of interesting finding, she was so low in glycine. This is a closer look at it down there at the bottom right. You can see it was low. For the oxidative stress markers, you can see on the left, the antioxidants there. Glutathione was, I would say, suboptimal. We really want to see glutathione above 1,000. That would put it into the green part of the scale there. She was doing okay on CoQ10, didn't need any help there. Maybe that was coming from the multivitamin, but she was low in glutathione, and we did see some lipid peroxidation just to the right of the glutathione there at 7.5 was borderline high, indicating some oxidative damage to the cell membranes. Taking a look at her GI effects, this is the front page. On the left side, you can see those functional imbalance scores indicating some moderate maldigestion because the pancreatic elastase was borderline low, and some dysbiosis as well. The P bacteria that are mentioned there underneath the functional imbalance score for dysbiosis is referring to what we found in the culture results, which we'll take a look at a little bit later. But you can see there was some significance here, some work to do in the GI effects. The commensal balance on the left side of the page there comes from the third page of the report. And it's that big picture assessment on the microbiome. Was it balanced or imbalanced? And it's a calculation that's made using the data from page 5. So it looks at the 24 commensal bacteria and makes an overall assessment. Was it balanced or imbalanced? And what's interesting in her case was that 3 of arguably the most beneficial bacteria were among the lowest. So even though there's not a lot that's flagged here on page 5 of the GI, we do see Lactobacillus, Bifidobacterium, and Akkermansia either low or borderline low. The culture results showed a couple of organisms to deal with, Citrobacter and Enterobacter. They are listed as PP or potentially pathogenic bacteria. You could think of them kind of like opportunistic organisms where they could maybe take advantage of a situation where there's not enough beneficial bacteria around. And they're usually associated with looser stools, Citrobacter and Enterobacter. So in a patient with loose stools, maybe that makes a stronger case to use an antimicrobial. But this patient was constipated, and we did see some dysbiosis, and we saw a lack of some of the beneficial organisms. So wouldn't be unreasonable to start there. Beta-glucuronidase, we spoke a lot about that earlier. It was measured, and it was found to be normal here. So this is, a good example of how, a normal amount is. It's not always that if you see dysbiosis that you're going to see a high beta-glucuronidase. You can still have some dysbiosis in a normal beta-glucuronidase, and it does give you some information about the possibility of recirculating toxins and steroid hormones. The stool consistency here, this patient reported it as hard constipated, so that was notable and consistent with what she had shared. So we've done our testing, and we have a lot of useful data here. So which of these phases needs the most support? I think it's hard to say. They're all in need of a little help here. And, in terms of a supplement plan, we're going to take a look at that in a moment. So thinking back to some of these therapeutic tools that we can use to influence estrogen metabolism, what we want to do is slow down production of the 4-hydroxyestrogens for her because they were high. And that could be done through avoiding toxic exposures, supporting with bioflavonoids maybe. Those things might help to slow down that 1B1 enzyme, limiting the amount of 4-hydroxy that we produce. At the same time, we want to support production of the 2-hydroxyestrogens. And that's where the cruciferous vegetables, indole-3-carbinol or DIM, may be helpful. They can support that 1A1 enzyme. So if we can get that 1A1 pathway working well, we could potentially take away some opportunities to make 4-hydroxy, which would be ideal. The antioxidants and methylation support are going to be complementary to these strategies. So that's kind of the main takeaway when we think about this from a pathway standpoint there. To put it a little differently, this is kind of an overview where we see in phase 1, cruciferous vegetables, bioflavonoids, limiting toxic exposures wherever possible. Those are going to support 1A1 and and kind of reduce the potential to send things down that 1B1 pathway. And in phase 2, for her in particular, glycine looked really important. She was really low in glycine, so she needed some help there. And antioxidants also seemed to be pretty important too. That could be helpful. And then in phase 3, pro and prebiotics, we saw a need for that from the GI effects, maybe putting a little more emphasis on dietary fiber, colorful fruits and vegetables, things like that, and some digestive enzymes. Maybe with her larger meals, she was having some bloating, so I think that does make sense. The pancreatic elastase was a little suboptimal, so it wouldn't be unreasonable to consider some enzymes. And of course, hydration and physical movement, also important for supporting phase 3. All right, so the supplement plan. This is just an example of what you could do. Maybe switching from that multivitamin to one that's a little higher quality could go some way in terms of helping to meet some of those needs. You can see essentially 2 products targeting each phase in this plan because I think she really did need help in all 3 phases. So you see a couple products there for phase 1, a couple of products there for phase 2. And then, of course, we can't ignore that low DHEA that did look significant and could be helpful to her energy level potentially. So that's how the supplement plan laid out for this patient. Aside from the supplement plan, talking about maybe switching from that low-carb diet to more of a Mediterranean diet with some higher quality carbohydrates may help her energy level as well, because people who do a lot of aerobic and endurance exercise, some people just run a little better with some good quality carbohydrate on board. And we're talking Mediterranean diet there. So that's I think, pretty much always a safe bet. And then stress management, that also seemed important. She worked a stressful job. So maybe substituting some of that high intensity activity for something that's a little more grounding and calming, like yoga or Tai Chi, possibly. And then maybe sleep hygiene. She needed a little bit more sleep, in my opinion. And also, talking to her about, sleeping in a cool, dark room, minimal noise, things like that. So things that aren't quite listed on the supplement plan, but are still important and, supportive of her overall health. So that's how the supplement plan laid out. As we wrap things up here, I just wanted to say a few words about laboratory quality, something that Genova takes very seriously. Genova is licensed by CLIA at the federal level, as well as every state that requires it, in addition to participating in all the internal and external quality assurance programs. And that has, that commitment to quality has been recognized not only by our clients, but also by some other prominent laboratories.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.